So let's understand what's happening in the brain under states of stress and trauma. We know that stress fires what's called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And it's a system. It's not just in our brain. It's that when we are experiencing stress, it comes into the brain, it activates the HPA axis, and that axis goes and tells the adrenal glands to release cortisol, and systems and different things happen. Our sympathetic nervous system gets fired up in our body. And normally it's just a very healthy response that just goes through us and it moves out. There's books like Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And one of the reasons zebras don't get ulcers or some of these digestive disorders or the diseases of inflammation and stress is because when zebras get stressed out, it's usually because something is trying to kill them. And so they run away when they are scared. What happens when you are quarantined on lockdown and you're experiencing stress? You sit there. Maybe you pour some wine. Maybe you go on social media, but these stress chemicals are being released in our body and we're not moving them. So another pathway to having a more resilient landscape and less of a vulnerable landscape is to move our body, move the stress through our body. When our stress becomes chronic, then what happens is the fact that the stress releases chemicals within our body, and those chemicals are stressful. Having inflammatory responses in your body, so stress releases cytokines in our body. Cytokines are little chemical trails that are being released in our body that makes things swell and cause inflammation. That would have been really helpful a few hundred years ago when the type of stress we experienced was likely to cause damage to our body. Inflammation goes up during stress because the body is basically getting ready to clean up you getting bit, cut, or wounded. And it's actually a really healthy response because guess what? If with that stressful response you got bit, cut, or wounded, you would heal faster because that inflammatory response was kind of already ready to take care of you. Our inflammatory response is like the nurses that are like ready to perform triage. Or say, doctor, we need you in aisle 4 or whatever, in room 4, whatever. That's what our inflammatory response does. But guess what? Having inflammation present in your body without getting those stress chemicals used up is actually a stressful state to the body. And so what happens is chronic stress, day 1 of quarantine, week 1 of quarantine, week 4 was okay, week 7, week 10, oh my God, how much longer is this going to go on? We have to deal with our stress levels on a day-to-day basis so that we are not going to make this chronic stress that also then creates cortisol resistance and really starts to create long-term damage in our body, which can be referred to as something called allostatic load. Allostatic load is when your body creates a new normal for the chronic conditions that it's been put under, that our metabolism, our endocrine system creates a new normal that is very different. And that's why prior to this, I hope that this is a wake-up call for people with pre-existing conditions, obesity, heart disease, any of the metabolic syndromes, that yes, your body has this experience, but there's so much that we could do. The body is so forgiving that when we start to tame our stress response, when we start to eat well and move well and breathe well and connect well, your body will actually know how to heal itself. What I found with my father, with all of the pre-existing conditions he had, the diabetes, he started to lose his hearing because of the side effects of being when he had bladder cancer. There were some things that happened and he ended up having a massive infection in his body, and he wound up on antibiotics, on drip antibiotics, and for an extended period of time, something like 3 months. And with that caused him to lose hearing in one ear. And my father, may he rest in peace, he just didn't know any different. He sometimes would just feel like he was a victim of what was happening in his body. He'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. I can't believe I got bladder cancer. Dad, you smoked for 35 years. Smoking is one of the things that actually has been shown to cause bladder cancer. And he'd be like, I can't believe this happened. I'm like, it could have happened for other reasons, but there's this thing. And it's like, our body isn't doing anything wrong. Our body is reacting. It's doing a very healthy response. It's performing a very healthy response to an unprecedented circumstance, a very different environment. So we have to hack our body accordingly. We have to know how to take care of it. The other thing I want you to understand is that, yes, the brain perceives the trauma, and that there are certain things that we are unconditionally wired to respond to as stress. These are called UTSs, unconditional threat stimuli, that you do not need to be conditioned. You do not need to learn how to be afraid of the following things: abandonment, the smell, sight, and sound of a predator, being killed by a predator, being in pain, heights, suffocating, being trapped, open spaces by yourself, open space with a lot of friends. Whee, that's fun. Open spaces by yourself, terrifying. You don't have to learn how to actually be stressed out to those things. Ground-based predators, darkness and nighttime, or air-based predators. These are predators. These are experiences that we do not need to learn, that will make us instantaneously react with a threat response. Coronavirus is not on this list. Economic downfall, not on this list. What will happen to my parents? Not on this list. What if I can't get a job? Not on this list. Most of the things that we are worrying about are conditioned threat responses. We have learned that threat response the same way that if I were to put a gun up on the screen, or I held a pistol in front of you, you guys would actually have a stress response. Your cortisol levels would rise, your body would start to produce a little bit of adrenaline, and your heart rate would speed up, and your breathing would get shallow. But if you brought an alien down, or like a human being that has never learned what a gun is, they actually would just hold it as like, wow, what's this weird thing? I don't know what this thing is. So much of what we are threatened by right now, for the most part, is a conditioned threat stimuli, or something that we've paired, which is really important, because when I'm thinking about people winding up traumatized after coronavirus, if we don't know how to take care of ourselves, any of these stimuli can be things that are going to fire off your amygdala, get you stressed out. Anything that's been paired with that stimuli, putting on gloves, may bring back to some of those first responders flashbacks of coronavirus. The smell of hand sanitizers, for some people, 5, 10, 15 years out into the future, might still bring back heart racing, pit of their stomach, mind racing, if they have been exposed to trauma. The sound of sirens, the smell of disinfectant wipes. These are things that get paired with those stimuli of life-threatening circumstance, terrible things that you had to witness, watching, hearing the news, hearing the death tolls rise. This is the only time in history where we have had access to this much visual stimuli. Just a few hundred years ago, we still passed the news along through written response. Only in the past, what it probably is, we're coming probably across it's only been a little over 100 years that we've even invented the camera, which had the ability to record pictures of events. Our brain is wired to react more to pictures than it is to words. When you see a picture of somebody being wheeled away, your brain doesn't really know the difference between like, wow, that's not really happening in my own life right now. And now we have video. You might as well be in a virtual reality game experiencing some of these things, because our brain has the capacity to actually treat those experiences and treat them as your own. Seeing people with expressions of pain, of loss, of suffering, we are wired as human beings, unless you're a psychopath or sociopath, when you witness suffering, if you let yourself feel it, your body, your mirror neurons will fire, and your body will release those stress chemicals in your body, and you will vicariously experience the trauma through them, unless you choose not to. You don't always have to choose not to. I mean, you don't always have to do so. When I'm working with my coaching clients and I'm using these, and I can witness a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, and I can empathize with my clients. I can feel what they're feeling, but I know how to soothe my own nervous system at the same time. So oftentimes when my clients are telling me something and they are really upset, I'll be doing this with my hands. I am self-soothing my body calming my nervous system down so that I can feel what they're feeling, but I'm not coding it in my brain as a traumatic event, because I know how my brain works. And so it's really important that we know that we have choices. You can choose to be compassionate to people without empathizing what they're feeling, because you want to reserve your empathy for the people that need you, that you want to feel what they're feeling, to deepen your connection with them. I can't empathize with every single person out there right now that's losing their father or their parents. My heart just can't handle it. But I have compassion for them, and I can have love, and I can send love to them. And I can totally honor when I need to numb out. For like 2 weeks, I did not read the paper at all. I was just like, I'm done with statistics. I'm done with our president that thinks it's a good idea to drink bleach. I'm done with it, right? Because that was traumatizing me. I was fine, dealing fine, okay with my father. Like when the stress response, the anger at our system, when I recall what happened, I'm not angry at the situation. I'm not angry at the fact that I couldn't get him onto hospice care because hospice was so busy. I'm not angry that I had to beg people to let me cut in line, and some people wouldn't let me cut in line when I said, please, I need to get to the pharmacy. My father is alone, he's dying, and I need to get back to him. And some people actually didn't let me cut the line. I knew how to calm myself down and haven myself during those moments. Those don't raise a very high stress response. I am likely to be more traumatized by our president because he can get me from 0 to 60 in an instant. And I frequently have to calm myself down. So his picture winds up being a threat stimuli for me if I don't know how to deal with it. So these are important to know. We want to understand how the amygdala works. All stress is processed within that teeny tiny area of the brain called the amygdala. And just a little bit basics that are helpful to understand what's actually happening in our brain. So stressful stimuli comes in either through our visual cortex, our auditory cortex, or our somatocortex, meaning we experience something that may be dangerous, may not be. It's just a sound, like you're out in the wild and you hear a sound in the grass underneath you. Is it or you see something and it's like, is it a snake or is it a stick? We don't know. What happens from that space is that things that come in through our senses go to a part of our brain called the thalamus. From that, each of the points of our thalamus have a specific area in our sensory cortex that is tied to each of those senses. So the visual go to our visual sensory cortex, our auditory goes to our auditory cortex, so on and so forth. There are also areas, senses that actually don't even go into the cortex at all, or our rational thinking brain, that actually go directly to our amygdala. Our sense of smell is actually so important for survival that it actually goes right to the amygdala. So something potentially dangerous is detected and it goes to our amygdala and it goes to our neocortex at the same time. The cortex then can decide, hey, is it actually dangerous or is it not? And if it's not, it just passes the information along. Or it says, hey, this is dangerous. It says, hey, this is dangerous, and it goes to our amygdala. If it is dangerous, the amygdala talks to your hypothalamus and says, take action. Your pituitary glands and your adrenal glands will start to kick off a series of chemicals that make you run away or make you want to fight or are so stressful that make you want to freeze. So the important thing is to remember that it's not just our sensory thalamus, though, that impacts come on, doodling. It's not just our thalamus that takes in our senses that passes the information along to the amygdala. It is also our thoughts, our feelings, our comprehensions, our thoughts, our memories can also feed into the amygdala at the same time. And so this is really important to know, because you may not actually need to see something in order to get the traumatic pathways going in our body, that simply thinking about it may actually do the same thing as well. And so we can fire off the amygdala. I'm going to show you a video now, and thank you those of you who are still here with me. I am grateful for you continuing with me. I'm almost on slide 50 of 73, so we're moving along quite well. And let me just send a message to my, okay, there we go. All right, so here's a short video clip. It's a 3-minute clip that talks about a very simplified explanation of how does trauma, what are scientists currently thinking about as to how trauma is coded in the brain. And so this is how the brain encodes trauma. You should be able to hear the audio. Let me just check.
Trauma. As we move through life, the way we experience the world around us is through our senses. We use what we hear, what we see, what we smell, what we touch, and what we taste to encoding a trauma. As we move through life, the way we experience the world around us is through our senses. Move through life, the way we experience the world around us is through our senses. We use what we hear, what we see, what we smell, what we touch, and what we taste to develop our perceptions, observations, inferences, and reactions to everything we interact with. As this takes place, our brain is engaged in an incredibly compelling manner while we use all of our senses. When we have an experience, the brain will encode the information as traumatic when 4 conditions are met: event, meaning, landscape, and inescapability. These are the foundations by which a series of chemical reactions take place within our bodies and our brains that help us to encode, handle, and weather a traumatic experience. To use an example, let's say your body experiences a physical event that belies the onset of trauma. The moment the trauma starts, a 100 Hz high-frequency incoming gamma wave is generated by the trauma. In your brain, the excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate is released and excites pathways in the limbic system, including helping to activate chemical responses in neurons in the amygdala. In particular, specific glutamate receptors called AMPA receptors are activated, and the following neurochemicals are also released: dopamine, cortisol, and noradrenaline. In addition, your AMPA receptors are phosphorylated by a chemical similar to PKM-zeta. This PKM-zeta-like chemical has a profound impact on how we react and encode traumatic experiences. As a phosphokinase, the PKM-zeta-like chemical affects the potentiation of our AMPA receptors on the surface of our postsynaptic neurons in the lateral amygdala. This heightens our senses and reactions of fight, flight, fear, or defensive rage. The actual glue that anchors AMPA receptors to the surface of neurons is a phosphate. PKM-zeta-like enzyme phosphorylates the AMPA reactors, empowering them to aid our brains as we experience trauma and to help protect us in future similar situations. The brain stores all kinds of information about a traumatic event, including the threatening content, associated content, and context. It includes storage of cognitive, autonomic, somatosensory, and emotional aspects of the experience. This allows our bodies, when pitted within similar traumatic situations again, to assess and make decisions based on how to avoid these situations before we suffer a trauma again, or to be prepared to fight it or escape from it if we need to.
Great. Thank you guys for watching that. So one of the key things, a very simplified way of understanding what this is said, and hopefully this was simple enough, is that when our body experiences a traumatic or something that is very stressful, that when it meets those conditions, all of these chemicals flood our brain. And our brain, on those neurons, right? Imagine these are neurons, and there's a neuron and a synaptic gap between the neuron. They're gonna send out chemical messages that are supposed to be caught by little catcher mitts, which are called receptors on the receiving synapse, the presynapse and the postsynapse. So within the amygdala, what happens is that when something is really stressful, normally it'd be like, I'm going to simplify this, it'll be like 10 little cortisol and glutamate chemical, 10 little molecules of glutamate would be thrown out across the synapse. And on a healthy day, we have 10 little catcher's mitts that catch all of those little individual little glutamates. They catch them, they absorb them, and they pass them along the neuron to keep going and pass the information in through the brain. But what happens when something is really stressful? You went from having 10 little glutamate chemicals being sent at you, mind you, this is very, very simplified, and all of a sudden it's 10,000. A flood of glutamate chemicals are in the synapse. The body learns How does it learn? It actually grows new catcher's mitts on the surface of the synapse. That is the brain's way of saying, holy shit, that was really scary, don't forget. And you literally, we can't do this in humans, but we know it's the same wiring in rats as it is in humans. You can actually count this. You can traumatize a rat and count the number of AMPA receptors on the synapse before trauma and after trauma. Unfortunately, we know a lot about how to traumatize a rat. It breaks my heart because I'm an animal lover, but what they do is they go in, they can put a little camera really deep into the brain, they can count how many receptors there are, then you hang a rat upside down by its tail for like a while, and that is incredibly stressful to it. It actually will create a traumatic event, just hanging it upside down by its tail. It can't go anywhere, breaks my heart. They put a camera inside again, and you will literally see that weeks later, months later, those that have been were under those stressful conditions, especially repeatedly, will have permanently more AMPA receptors on the synaptic cleft. This is the way that trauma creates permanent changes in our brain. We are making trauma and stress can over time create permanent changes to not just the anatomy of our brain, meaning it's actually changing what's actually present, the quantity of little catcher's mitts. And therefore, it also changes the physiology of how it is firing. What we know is that under healthy circumstances, my emotional brain and my rational brain work really well together. My emotional brain is on a healthy level of looking out for stress in the environment when it is appropriate. And when it is not appropriate, it just hangs out and it enjoys life and it enjoys foods and sounds and connection with people. And it doesn't overfire. My amygdala doesn't need to be constantly overfiring unless I hear a loud noise and I go, what's that? Or unless I hear stressful news and I need to leap into action. And my conscious, rational thinking brain is in control, and my amygdala is there as the backseat driver that's happily reading a book. Trauma and high levels of stress will actually create neuronal pathways, putting the limbic system in the driver's seat. These are the people who get easily triggered. It's like ready, fire, aim. The people who just they go off the edge. The people who something that was like someone pisses them off and they're raging, or something that might worry someone puts them into panic. These people who have what we would call a lower self-regulatory response, we define that as their limbic system is controlling the show more than their rational thinking brain. Stages of brain development will make this the case just naturally. So we call it, toddlers will throw a temper tantrum because they have a very underdeveloped neocortex. So they're more likely to be reactive. Teenagers have an underdeveloped neocortex, a neocortex that's actively pruning back transmitters, neurons that they don't need, and is very plastic, is rapidly changing with a very strong emotional response, with tons of brain chemicals like testosterone and estrogen and all these chemicals moving through their body. There's a reason that they're a little bit risky in their behavior and they can be a little overly emotional and things just feel really dramatic. It's not them, it's their brain. So stress begins to give power to our emotional brain unless you know how to control your stress response. And when we know how things are coded, we can explore self-care strategies for how to take care of our brain, recognizing that it is the influx of the stress that is making our brain have this permanent change. And for a long time, they thought that that change was permanent. And that's because they would use talk therapy and other things as to try to get and reach that emotional brain. But we know that the talking happens in the outer layer of the cortex, where the pain is being experienced in the inner brain. And so we just didn't have the right tools. Now we have the right tools as to how to actually talk to the emotional brain rather than to the rational brain. And that's what I want to share with you guys. Let me stop the recording.